Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Politics Relaxed. So today we're going to be talking about the American elections. We got the midterms coming up this Wednesday. The results will be Tuesday voting. We've got a bit of a different panel as well, which is exciting. We got kind of a few writers. I mean, Sam and Joel, you've written for the website, and if you're a real old time subscriber, then you'll probably remember Caleb. Um, but it's nice to have you guys on for a bit of a different perspective. I wonder where we start. Maybe we start for an overall kind of thoughts on what's going to happen on Wednesday and some of the key issues, maybe. Joel?
Yeah, I think it is hard to tell right now, but if I was a betting man, I would say that the Democrats will 100% lose control of the House, and most likely the Senate's a real toss up at the moment. But if I had to bet, I would say that they might have a slight control of the House. Um, because from my perspective, the Dems are running much better candidates than the Republicans for the Senate. Maybe a victory for the Biden camp as well as a defeat, because if you had said at the beginning of the year that they had a chance of maintaining the Senate, it would have been not, believed. So I think that sort of there's showing momentum for the Dems. It's not going to be a complete catastrophe.
Yeah, it certainly feels like he's turned it around a little bit, especially in the last few months. He started bringing forward a new legislation, things like that, that have really kind of maybe pushed things to his side. But it's not looking great for him, and I think that's
I,
probably an
I,
indictment. Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
even like policy plans which have passed through the House and the Senate, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not even that popular amongst the US electorate. And the Dobbs decision, which basically got rid of Roe v. Wade, isn't having as big as an electoral impact as the Dems actually thought, with the cost of living crisis being and inflation being more important.
Yeah, all the polls are indicating that pretty much the House is a foregone conclusion. That's going to go to the Republicans with almost certainly. In 2020 they won a lot of the state legislatures, the governorships. Of course, they were able to redistrict, gerrymander. It's a lot of people are alleging. They're the clear favorite in the House. The Senate, to be honest, this is probably one of the best Senate maps for the Democrats. It's unfortunate for them that it comes at a midterm, because historically, as I'm sure everyone knows, the party in power is not going to does not fare well.
Yeah.
I think there were two exceptions, like 2002 and was it 1998 or something, but those were exceptional circumstances, and even then the margin wasn't very big.
Yeah.
So it's definitely good. It's definitely going to be tight in the Senate. I agree that the Democrats have much stronger candidates. Of course, a lot of the nominees have been Trump. Were endorsed by Trump. Trump, he seems to. I mean, there's one. Well, we can get into it later, but Trump doesn't seem to choose the most qualified candidates, of course,
Yeah.
because the less qualified they are, the more likely they are to just cozy up to him.
No, I was
My
just saying it was
opinion.
interesting. I was reading, so 35% of all GOP candidates believe that the election was completely stolen and that Trump should have won. And I think it was 50% of them that they have doubts over the election result. So I think the interesting thing about Trump, which I mean, maybe we talk about now just because Caleb brought it up, is that he's almost. I mean, this is a bit of a weird comparison, but he's also almost the Jeremy Corbyn of the Republican Party, because he takes, in terms of what he's done to the Republican Party, he split them around the middle sort of area on Trump, because there's a lot of Republicans who are very pro-Trump, and there are a lot of people in
Right.
America that are very pro-Trump, but it's not a majority, and that's the key thing. It's not a winning majority, and that's why the Republicans are in such a tough place at the minute, because they can't get anyone to unite around one issue because they are so split around pro-Trump or anti-Trump, and that's really where the Republicans are going to struggle, I think.
I completely agree. Like the division in the GOP is evident. Like, for example, so in the governor's race, so moderate governors in Phil Scott in Vermont and Chris Sununu in New Hampshire have been openly criticized by Donald Trump for being so-called rhinos and Republican in name only, as per se. And then also you've got the right wing of the GOP, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, in Georgia. So there is going to even in the GOP, there's an element of polarization.
Although I will say though, I think that the anti-Trump Republicans are in a complete rout right now. Like a lot of smoke was made about like the Lincoln Project in 2020 of moderate Republicans who were for Joe Biden, but it seems like every single one of them, although they may be present in the media, in the actual Republican Party, they're being destroyed. Like Liz
Yeah,
Cheney
Liz Cheney.
lost, the Cheney family, the Republican political dynasty
Yeah,
lost her
Wyoming.
seat in the re-election, yeah, in Wyoming. Um, and everyone else, like even Mike Pence, who Trump's supporters threatened to hang, one of the objectives was the hang, hasn't he's been kind of critical, but he hasn't objectively said this guy's supporters tried to kill me. Please don't he said I'm not going to say what my thoughts on him are. So the anti-Trump right wing of the Republicans are in a complete rout, I would say. It's dominated by the Trump side of the party.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that there are divisions within the Republican Party. And I think, honestly, the reason why, so you have these fringe candidates in the Republican Party, they usually never really rise up in the Democratic Party. I don't know what the dynamics are, but there's something where the Democrats have a harder time, letting someone who's just charismatic, but, maybe is not moral or is just really far right, basically. But, in the Democratic side, it'd be far left. They usually have a hard time, rising to the surface. I mean, this year, I don't think divisions within the Republican Party are really going to be a factor because, in the eyes of most
Yeah,
voters, the Democrats, you can argue how much control they had over the economy and whether that it was just inevitable, but a lot of it is just alternatives, right? It's the Democrats really haven't done a great job. So what is there to lose voting for Republicans, especially because you have Biden to check Republican, the
yeah.
Republican Congress, assuming they do win both houses.
And maybe some moderate voters who wouldn't vote for Trump are voting for their respective Republican candidates, considering Trump's not actually on the ticket this time.
I would also say the fact that Trump's not on the ballot is interesting for the polling because
Mhm.
a lot of people, people say that or people are reluctant to say that they're supporting Trump. So potentially the polls, which have tended to favor Democrats in the past, or at least in recent election years, maybe might be slightly tilted the other way.
I mean, maybe we move on to some kind of the key races. There's been a lot of interesting ones. I mean, we've got, I think my personal favorite would have to be John Fetterman, Mehmet Oz, because
Fantastic.
it's so exciting. I mean, there's so much to talk about. Maybe we each individually focus on the ones that we've been interested in, then we can just go off that.
Well, if we're doing individual races, I think one that's going to be really, really interesting is the Georgia race. And that is between Raphael Warnock, the incumbent, and Herschel Walker. And I think that is proven to be really interesting because proves what I was saying earlier, how the Dems have a really, really good candidate. Warnock, liked in his constituency, good speaker, good on policy, compared to the GOP candidate who is, suffering from, some kind of illness in the head, as well as a scandal like the stuff that came out about his abortion scandals in the past. So I think that Georgia is a seat that should be in a year like this, in a red wave year, should be easily Republican. It shouldn't even be talked about.
Mhm.
But the fact that the GOP have chosen such a bad candidate, the Dems have chosen such a good one, and Georgia seems to be flipping in general, means they might keep the full Georgia Democrat delegation. And I think that if I had to put a predictor, I think it's going to be a Warnock. Warnock will win re-election in that seat.
I do think Herschel Walker's definitely been helped by the fact that Brian Kemp's also on the ballot for governor. He's quite popular across the state of Georgia, and Stacey Abrams, who technically denied losing the last governor election in 2018. Doesn't seem to be as popular as she was in 2018 either.
Yeah, it is interesting how Brian Kemp and the Secretary of State Raffensperger, I think, of course they stood up against Trump, in his attempts to not to say overturn the election, but at least cast doubt on the results and potentially stop them from legitimizing and certifying. It's interesting how they're now seemingly, sure bets in this election. I mean, they're just strong candidates, and that I guess should be encouraging for some of the moderate Republicans that there still is. Republicans are still motivated by the core issues, and not just by Trump, basically. I think Georgia 2020 election pretty much shows that it is a toss-up state.
Yeah.
And so, I think Democrats could easily hold that seat. And Republican candidate could not be weaker. So we'll just have to see. But I think a 3-point swing in the Republican, in the popular vote, would probably be the limit. I think after the Democrats have lost that, because just Herschel Walker's alliance with the Republican Party and Trump is probably enough to get him elected if there is that clear Republican edge on election night.
See, even in the polls, Herschel Walker's only leading by 0.5%. So, I mean, Joe and Caleb's point about it being a true toss-up, I think out of all the states, this one's definitely the hardest to predict. I think in Pennsylvania, as we can move on to John Fetterman and Mount Oz, I think even though the polls have closed up, I think we will see a John Fetterman victory there, despite his terrible debate performance, where he repeated the same line 3 times in a question about fracking.
Well, with regards to Fetterman, I think that he's an interesting one because he was sort of one of the progressive side of the Democratic Party's big standard bearers, and people were very excited when he won the primary against Conor Lamb, and he seemed to have been doing really well, but this stroke seems to have completely incapacitated him. And it was, people thought that it was, improving, but that debate performance was very rough. And I think that despite, Dr. Oz is also, in my opinion, a very bad candidate. And so you have these 2 candidates that going to prove interesting, and I think that might have repercussions for the especially if John Fetterman loses, for the progressive side of the Democratic Party, because he was their guy, and then the more moderate Josh Shapiro, who's the Democrat candidate for governor, looks to be a shoo-in. So you have this moderate Democrat doing really well and this progressive Senate candidate lagging behind a little bit. So that's going to be interesting in Democrat internal politics.
I do think, just from watching the debate, just from an objective point of view, if many independent candidates would sway towards Mount Oz, regardless of how bad of a candidate he is, generally just because of queries over whether John Fetterman is fit enough to serve in the US Senate.
Right. I mean, to be fair to John Fetterman, I mean, he was a perfectly solid candidate, before his stroke, being lieutenant governor. I'm sure his mental faculties before the stroke were perfectly fine. It's just this freak event, and you really have to feel bad for the people of Pennsylvania that they're left with this choice of someone who has no loyalty to Pennsylvania whatsoever, has effectively bought their way into this race, which is Mehmet Oz, and he could only have done it with the endorsement of Donald Trump. And then you have John Fetterman, who previously was, a solid candidate, someone who would have been probably a decent senator. But now it's unclear whether, what impact this stroke is going to have going forward. Of course, just the immediate impact is evident, but whether people will start to question, his long-term recovery, that could be another issue.
Yeah, for sure.
To look at.
I think if we have a look at Arizona, Felix, you touched on it. I mean, it's between the main two, between Mark Kelly and Blake Masters, and the key thing is, for me, is actually the third-party candidate Mark Victor has just pulled out of the race and endorsed Blake Masters. So I think that 1 or 2% going towards Blake Masters could make this a very, very interesting race, and could potentially see, unfortunately, Mark Kelly lose his seat in Arizona, who, for me personally, is my favorite senator in the whole US Senate.
Yeah, I mean, Blake Masters, I think, is less of a weak candidate than the other Republican candidates we've discussed. but he's also very interesting because he's sort of I think Peter Thiel's like apprentice, who's like this weird conservative billionaire who keeps backing weird candidates, and that's going to be really interesting if Blake Masters actually wins. But Mark Kelly is a very strong senator. He's very famous. He used to be an astronaut. Personally, I think the polls are looking pretty good for Mark Kelly at the moment, but I didn't hear about the third party candidate dropping out. I don't know how that race is going to go. Blake Masters is a very unique candidate, I think, on the field because he's very conservative, very right wing, but not necessarily in the Trump sense, more from this like weird Peter Thiel like side project, which is going to be, I think, an interesting thing to see how that plays out.
I think we
I
covered.
think the only other one is in Nevada because I think North Carolina between Ted Bun, Cherry Beasley, that's going to stay red. Florida's gone to Marco Rubio, and Wisconsin looks like it's just going to stay at Ron Johnson. So I mean, in Nevada, that's also apart from Georgia, I reckon this is probably the second closest race between Adam Laxalt and Catherine Cortez Masto. I think historically, the Dems do have a history of being underpolled in Nevada. So even though Adam Laxalt's leading the poll, I reckon we might see a Catherine Cortez Masto victory here.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona is that in 2020, of course, the optimistic polls were indicating that Biden would win those states, but just based off how tight the races were in other parts of the country, you'd have probably thought, not knowing what the actual result was, that he had lost, Georgia, Arizona, and I mean Nevada. He was projected to win fairly easily, but it was actually extremely tight. So I think it just shows that these are all swing states and that they really, I mean, it's very hard to predict which way they will go. And to be honest, some could go one way, some can go the other. So I think, yeah, it's definitely hard to predict.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we move on to some of the key issues that have been talked about. We've got obviously the economy, which is the main one. And then we've got things like abortion with the Roe v. Wade ruling, means that in lots of states, this is going to be on the ballot for voters. I mean, there's so many different things you could touch on here. I guess maybe we go around and talk about some of those issues.
Yeah, well, on abortion, I think, that is the reason why the Dems are doing so well, quite frankly, in many cases, because I think that overturning Roe v. Wade was such an unpopular and such a extremist action from the GOP that it backfired on them massively. And I think what was interesting is if earlier on in the summer, the polls were really, really good for the Dems, even in the House. Like that's how the Dobbs ruling was pushing them over the line. And I think that if the election was a bit sooner, then we would see the Democrats sweep purely because of abortion. But now that is sort of more in the past, less in the voters' memory, and the cost of living crisis is more of a thing. Biden's governance is on the ballot. Abortion was the biggest issue, but now it's fading. And the less important abortion is, the better the Republicans do, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think Joel's point about overturning Roe v. Wade being unpopular, I think that's evident. In August, there was a referendum in Kansas, actually, which is a fairly conservative state where actually they voted against banning abortion on a state level.
I think if this had happened 3 months ago, as we've kind of mentioned, it would have been a very different story because you had gun rights and you had the Roe v. Wade ruling, which were the two kind of issues that gripped America for a while. But now, as we've mentioned, it's shifting, and I saw a poll, I think it was 45% or maybe it was 50% of Americans, the main thing they're going to be voting on now is the economy, whereas only 15% on abortion. So the tides are very much shifting and have shifted in the last 3 months to favour the Republicans, and I think the issues on the ballot are probably one of the main reasons.
It will be interesting to see what happens regarding abortion across America. I mean, if the GOP win both the House and the Senate, we could see a potential move to go for a nationwide federal abortion ban. Lindsey Graham from South Carolina has proposed that in the Senate. So I think that it's going to be this is probably one of the most important midterms in a very long time.
Yeah, it definitely feels more important than the ones in the past. I definitely agree with that. I mean, do we talk about Joe Manchin a little bit because of how
Yeah,
consequential he's been for the last 2 years for the Democrats, and now, I mean, I suppose what the Democrats sort of hoped for is to increase their majority so they could actually pass things, but it's looking less and less likely.
yeah. I mean, Joe Manchin has been the major roadblock in Biden's aims of getting his policies through Congress, blocking Build Back Better, the infrastructure bill, and the Reduction Inflation Act really only being a fraction of what Build Back Better was.
I think though, on assuming the Senate has a really good night for the Democrats, I think the Democrats could maybe pick up one extra seat. But then the issue is that you've also got Kristen Sinema
Yeah,
of Arizona,
yeah.
who also plays a similar role to Joe Manchin in blocking bills. So I think unless the Democrats crazy seats like Ohio and Wisconsin, they won't. Then they're going. The Biden's agenda is in jeopardy regardless, and the House also won't pass it because it will flip to the Republicans. So
Maybe we wrap it up a little bit, and I don't know, what are your predictions for the night, and
Yeah, like
who's going to be
yeah.
happy?
I think my predictions. A final prediction: I think the Democrats keep the Senate. I think the Republicans win the House. Governorship is going to be huge for the Republicans. I think that who's going to be happy, a little bit of both, because I think that Democrats won't necessarily experience the wipeout that they thought they were going to at the beginning of the year. Chuck Schumer gets to keep his job as Senate Majority Leader, but the Republicans are going to take it as a massive victory and a big condemnation of Biden's agenda when the House flips, which is they're going to call it a red wave. And so I think a bit of both for both sides, but mainly the Republicans, I think, are going to have a big night.
I'd say my prediction is in the House, I reckon the GOP are going to win over 240 seats. I think there's going to be a complete wipeout of the Democrats nationwide. Regarding the Senate, I think my prediction is that I think John Fetterman will win Pennsylvania, but then Catherine Cortez Masto will lose Nevada. So it's a fifth, but then Georgia will go to a runoff. So it's a 50-49 going into, I think they've moved the runoff to December now rather than January. But I reckon it'll be a 50-49 after election night, and then it'll depend again on the Georgia runoff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can make a prediction about the Senate because it is so close. I would say that recently, I think Democratic optimism has waned, and now they are sort of accepting the fact that there's a good chance that it could be a red wave. I think the House is, as I've said many times already, it's a foregone conclusion, basically. But yeah, I think the Senate is pretty much a toss-up.
Yeah.
That's all I can really say.
Yeah. I don't want to repeat what everyone else has said. I mean, obviously the House looking to go very Republican, and yeah, as mentioned about the Senate, I think the one person who's gonna have a good night is Donald Trump. I think he may end up pretty soon after this making more moves towards the presidency again, and I think he could use this night to really be a springboard for that presidential campaign if he chooses. I think we've covered a lot. You can watch our continued coverage of the midterms on the website, on the Instagram, on the Twitter. We should have an exciting interview, I think, coming up quite soon after the midterms with someone in America who is covering all of this. I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but you should definitely subscribe for that. And we'll definitely have reaction after the midterm. Thank you very much to you guys for coming along. Thank you to you for watching. Cheers.